Hello there, welcome to HFY Quantum Pro. Here, helping one another makes the universe smarter. So, what we are waiting for? Let's begin our story.
The mud was cold and deep, and it smelled like rot. Rail hit the ground first. He sank to his knees on impact, felt the wet earth pull at him like it wanted to keep him, and he let the momentum go instead of fighting it. A second later, Sova landed 3 meters to his left. She rolled, came up on one knee, and was already looking at the tree line before the sound of her landing had finished echoing. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The sky above was pale green. Two moons hung at the edge of the horizon, one large and dull, one small and sharp. The trees around them were enormous, black-barked, with wide flat leaves the color of old copper. The air was thick and tasted faintly of sulfur. Rail stood up slowly. He pressed the mud between his fingers and felt the texture of it. Coarse, mineral-heavy. He looked at the way the water pooled at the base of the nearest trees and noted which direction it ran. He checked the angle of the light source, a star too blue to be the sun, and turned his body until he felt the slight temperature change on his left cheek. Airflow from the north. Sova was doing her own reading. She crouched and pressed her palm flat on the ground, feeling for vibration. She tilted her head and listened. Then she stood and pulled her thin braid over one shoulder and looked at the nearest patch of open sky between the canopy. Gravity is lighter, she said quietly. About 0.7, Rail agreed. Maybe 0.75. Good for the joints. He almost smiled. Silver linings. They were wearing the same gray jumpsuits the Vorkai had dressed them in after capture. No shoes. The Vorkai had found footwear confusing and had simply not provided it. No tools. No food. The suit material was thin but oddly resistant to tearing. Rail had already tested a seam against a sharp piece of bark during transport and found it held well. He filed that away. Far above the canopy, past the atmosphere, a long vessel shaped like a curved spine sat in low orbit. On its observation deck, a row of Vorkai dignitaries stood behind a wide transparent panel and watched the two small figures through magnification screens. Counselor Bane stood at the center of the row. He was tall, even by Vorkai standards, with layered gray armor plates across his shoulders and a face that had the permanent, bored expression of someone who had seen too many of these hunts to find them interesting anymore. He glanced at the data panel beside him. Two subjects. Species, human. Planet of origin, Earth. Classification, Grade 3 prey. Grade 3 meant manageable. It meant the hunt would run its standard length, 6 cycles, and the hunters would return with trophies, and the dignitaries would go home satisfied. Grade 3 prey rarely lasted past the 3rd cycle. They panicked, made noise, moved in the wrong direction, and the Vorkai hunters found them quickly. They've stopped moving, one of the younger observers noted. They're in shock, said another. Bane said nothing. He watched the two figures on the screen and felt nothing in particular. He had seen dozens of prey species dropped on Grass Hollow. They all had the same first moments: confusion, fear, some attempt to run in a random direction. These two were standing still, which was slightly unusual, but not interesting. Animals froze sometimes. It changed nothing. On the surface, Rail was pulling bark from a dead tree with his fingers. He peeled a long strip and chewed one in slowly. Bitter. Possibly mildly toxic in high quantities. He spat and noted the taste for reference. Sova had climbed 3 meters up the nearest large tree using nothing but her arms and the friction of her bare feet against the bark. She sat in the first fork of the branches and turned in a slow circle, studying the landscape. Clearing about 400 meters east, she said. Water sound from the south. Wind from the north carries moisture. There's probably a second water source that way too. Which way did the drop ship go after it left? West. Then that is where their camp will be, or their pickup zone. He looked up at her. We go east. She came down the tree the same way she went up, controlled and quiet. A small drone, circular, flat, roughly the size of a dinner plate, drifted out from between two trees and hovered about 8 meters away. It had a single lens at its center that caught the light. It was watching them. Sova saw it first. She turned to face it fully and stood still. She did not raise her hands. She did not back away. She just looked at it the way she had once looked at a wolf in the Siberian expanse that had wandered too close to her camp, calmly, directly, without aggression and without fear. The drone hovered for several seconds. Then it drifted back and disappeared into the trees. Rail had watched the whole thing. How many do you think there are? Drones or hunters? Both. Sova thought about it. Several drones. Hunters, maybe 8. Maybe more. They will not come down right away. They will want us to tire first. Rail nodded. He looked at the direction the drone had come from, then looked away. He began walking east, stepping carefully around the wet ground, choosing firm earth with each footfall. They are watching, he said. Yes. Good. He kept walking. Let them. Above, on the observation deck, Counselor Bain finally looked away from the screen and reached for his drink. The hunt had started. In 4 or 5 cycles, it would be over, and they would all go home. He was certain of that. The fire should not have been hard to find. That was the first thing Dreth noticed when his team reached the area the drones had flagged. There was a fire. The thermal sensors had confirmed it twice during the night cycle. But the smoke had not risen. There was no column, no plume, nothing to track from above or from a distance. Just a faint heat signature spread low and thin across the ground like something had burned sideways instead of up. Dreth crouched beside the remains of it. The fire had been built inside a dry creek channel. The banks on either side were only knee-height, but they were enough. Whoever built, it had chosen a spot where the channel curved and narrowed, so the smoke coming off the coals had been broken up and dragged along the ground by the natural airflow until it dispersed into nothing before it cleared the tree line. He stayed crouched for a long moment, looking at it. Orvin stood behind him. He was younger than Dreth by about 12 years and had been on 4 hunts before this one, which made him experienced enough to know what was normal and knew enough to still be bothered when something was not. They built this on purpose, Orvin said. Dreth did not answer immediately. He was looking at the bones beside the fire pit. Small animal bones, the kind you found in the lower brush of Grass Hollow. But they had been cracked open cleanly and the marrow scraped out. Not chewed, scraped with something with a flat edge. And beside the bones there were 3 pieces of shaped wood. One was pointed, one was flat and curved slightly. One was too smooth to have happen naturally. Tools, Dreth said. From wood. Yes. Orvin looked at the tree line. They had been here less than 2 cycles. Dreth stood, and they're already fed and equipped. He did not say it with admiration. He said it like a fact he was still deciding what to do with. The rest of the hunting party spread through the campsite in a wide, slow search pattern. There were 6 of them, all experienced, all large, all wearing the light hunt armor that allowed quick movement through dense terrain. They were built for this. Vorkai hunters had been apex predators on their own world long before they became a spacefaring species, and nothing about that biology had softened. One of the younger hunters at the edge of the group moved toward a narrow gap between 2 trees. The gap was dark, and the ground beyond it was dry. A good path. The noise came without warning. A dry crack, then a deep hollow knock, then the slow, grinding collapse of a dead tree falling sideways. It hit a second tree on the way down, and the sound it made was enormous. A hard crack followed by a sustained crash that rolled through the forest and bounced off the creek banks and seemed to come from 3 directions at once. Every hunter in the group froze. Dreth's hand went to his weapon. Orvin dropped low. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved at all. Then the forest went quiet again. The dead tree had fallen. The ground under it had been cut partway through at the base. Not with a blade, but with something that had scraped and levered the wood until it was ready to go. A simple trigger, a bent branch under tension, released when a younger hunter's foot pressed the right piece of ground. Nobody was hurt. The tree had not fallen toward them. It had fallen away, parallel to their position, into empty brush. Orvin looked at Dreth. That was not a weapon. No, Dreth agreed. It was a test. Dreth looked at the fallen tree, at the scrape marks on the cut base, at the pressure trigger, still visible under the disturbed soil. Whoever built this had known exactly where the hunting party would approach from, had known which gap between the trees looked like the easiest path, had put a noise device, not a trap, a noise device precisely where the group's movement would find it. and for 3 seconds, 6 armed Vorkai hunters had stood completely still. Dreth did not say what that meant. He did not need to. Above, on the observation deck, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was hard to name. Nobody had left. Nobody was speaking much either. The screen showed the hunting party moving again, slower now, testing each step before committing to it. One of the dignitaries refilled his drink and did not look away from the screen while he did it. Counselor Bane stood with his arms folded. His expression had not changed, but one of his fingers was tapping slowly against his forearm, which was not something he normally did. Increase the drone coverage, he said to the technician beside him. We already have 4 units active. Add 2 more. In the forest, well ahead of Dreth's position, Rail was sitting in a wide, flat-limbed tree above the ground. He had been there since before the hunting party entered the camp. He had heard the collapse of the dead tree and felt the vibration of it through the bark under his hands. He counted the pause. 3 seconds. He climbed down and moved north to where Sova was waiting. 6, she said quietly. She meant hunters. I thought 8. 6 here. There may be more at the second entry point. He nodded. He thought about the marsh to the south and the ravine to the east. He thought about what 6 hunters who had just stood still for 3 seconds would do next. They would move slower. They would group tighter. They would leave the obvious paths alone. Good. Slower was better for what came next. By the 4th cycle, 3 drones had gone missing. Not destroyed. The signal from each one had simply stopped, cleanly, without static or the fragmented burst you got when a drone hit terrain. Just present, and then not present. The technician on the observation deck had checked the equipment twice and found nothing wrong on his end. The drones were gone. Somewhere on Grass Hollow, they were sitting silent, and nobody knew where. Bane had ordered the remaining drones to maintain greater distance from the target subjects. The technician obeyed without asking questions, because the look on Bane's face did not invite questions. Below, in the forest, the hunt was not going the way hunts went. Dreth's team had covered substantial ground over 4 cycles, but covering ground and finding prey were different things. They had found 3 more campsites, each cold by the time they arrived, each showing the same quiet, methodical pattern. Fire built low, food sourced locally, tools left behind that were used and then abandoned without sentiment, which meant the humans were not struggling to survive. They were moving through this moon the way someone moved through familiar territory. One of the campsites had been built inside a section of dense marsh at the forest's southern edge. This was not where prey went. The marsh had thin ground, poor footing, and the local wildlife, and it was unpleasant. Dreth's hunters had approached it, and 2 of them had refused to enter after the first 50 meters. Not because anything had happened to them, because of how the area looked, trails crossing in every direction, animal remains scattered at intervals, a collection of marks carved in a tree bark that made it feel like something large lived there and used this space regularly. It was not real. Dreth understood that after some study. The trails were designed to loop back on themselves. The animal remains were arranged, not left naturally. The bar carvings were not territorial markers. They were meaningless, made only to look like they meant something. It was theater. Whoever made it had wanted the area to feel occupied and dangerous without putting any real effort into defending it. 2 hunters refused to enter. Dreth did not force them. He noted the fact and moved on, but the note sat in the back of his mind and grew heavier as the cycles passed. Orvin had stopped making observations out loud. He walked close to Dreth now, which was not his habit, and he watched the tree line more than he watched the ground. He had the look of someone who was revising an assumption and did not enjoy the process. On the 5th cycle, they found the 3rd drone. It was sitting at the base of a tree at the edge of a clearing, upright, undamaged on the outside. The lens was dark. When the team's technician examined it, he found that the internal components had been removed in sequence. The power cell first, then the signal emitter, then the navigation unit, and placed in a neat row beside the body of the drone. The work had been done with a flat stone and a piece of wire made from stripped bark fiber. Every piece that could be removed had been removed. Scratched into the outer casing, in the standard trade script that appeared on the Vorkai's own release documentation, was a line of text. Dreth read it twice. We know how many you are." He stood there for a long time. The forest moved quietly around him. Somewhere above, through the canopy and through the atmosphere, Counselor Bane would be reading the same words on his screen. Dreth did not look up. "How did they learn trade script?" one of the younger hunters asked. "It was on their processing papers," Orvin said. His voice was flat. "When they were cataloged, they read it." Nobody said anything after that. On the observation deck, Bane turned from the screen and walked to the far end of the room. He stood there for a moment with his back to the others. One of the dignitaries, a senior figure from a trading house, quietly excused herself and left the room. Two others were having a low conversation in the corner that stopped when Bane turned around. "This changes nothing," Bane said. "The hunt continues." One of the remaining observers, Counselor Veth from the Serali delegation, who had said almost nothing since arriving, pulled out a small recording instrument and placed it on the table in front of him. He did not look at Bane when he did it. He simply set it down and turned it on. Bane looked at the device. Then he looked at Veth. "What is that for?" "Observation notes," Veth said calmly. "Standard practice for my office." There was a pause that lasted a little too long before Bane looked away. In the forest, Rail was already moving. He had watched the drone team from a distance, far enough to be invisible, close enough to see when the discovery was made. He had seen the hunters gather around the casing and then stand very still for some time. He rejoined Sova at their current camp, which was built at the intersection of two dry channels where the ground was hard enough to leave no footprints. "Did they find it?" she asked. "Yes." She waited. "They stood still for a while," he said. She nodded. That was what she had expected. She handed him a piece of cooked root. He ate it in 3 bites and looked at the forest around them. He was thinking about the ravine to the east and what shaken hunters would do when they reached it. He was already 3 steps ahead. He was comfortable there. Dreth made the decision to split his team on the morning of the 5th cycle. It was standard practice. When prey was mobile and the terrain was large, you divided your hunters into 2 groups, covered more ground, and drove the target toward the center. Every large predator on every world Dreth knew of used some version of this method. It was logical. It had always worked. He sent Orvin east with 2 hunters toward the ravine. He took the remaining 2 south toward the marsh and then west, curving around to cut off the far exit. If the humans were between them, there would be nowhere left to move. Dreth did not know that the terrain had been read. Not guessed. Not estimated. Read. The way Sova had been reading terrain since she was 14, and her family lived 3 weeks by foot from the near settlement. She had watched the hunting party for 4 cycles and understood how they thought about space. They moved toward gaps. They avoided elevation changes. They preferred dry ground. So she had gone to the ravine 6 hours before Orvin's team arrived. She found a flat-limbed tree at the top of the eastern wall, and she settled into it, and she waited. The ravine was not a dead end. There was an exit, uphill, narrow, covered in loose stone that would shift under weight. It looked passable. It was passable, but it was also loud, slow, and exposed, and anyone on the upper ridge could watch every step of it without being seen. Orvin entered the ravine from the north with his 2 hunters. They moved carefully now, feet tested before weight, eyes on the upper edges. But they were still following the path of least resistance, which was what Sova had predicted. She watched them and noted how the larger hunter favored his right side, old injury. She noted that Orvin scanned left first, meaning his left field was stronger. She noted they grouped tight when uncertain, which told her their default response to threat was to cluster rather than spread. She collected all of this and filed it away and did not move a single muscle that was not necessary. Below, Orvin's team reached the exit slope and started climbing. The loose stone shifted and clattered with every step. The larger hunter slipped once, caught himself, kept going. The process was slow and effortful, and by the time they reached the top, they were breathing hard. The ridge above the ravine was empty. No sign of the humans. No tracks on the stone. Orvin turned in a slow circle and looked at the trees around him. He had a feeling he did not like, the kind of feeling that came when something was watching you and you could not find it. Sova was already gone. She had moved when the first clattering of stones covered the sound of her movement. She was heading south to find Rail. In the marsh, Dreth's push was not going better. The ground sucked at every step, slowing the group and coating their armor in gray mud that added weight and made their joints work harder. One of the hunters, Dreth's most experienced tracker, stepped onto a patch of ground that looked solid and sank to mid-thigh. Pulling him out took several minutes and cost him a piece of equipment that dropped into the mud and was gone. Dreth said nothing about it. He kept moving, but the marsh seemed designed for exactly this, not to trap them, but to drain them, to take their time and their confidence in small, careful pieces. At one point, Dreth stopped and looked at the ground ahead and realized that the path he was following, the firmest, clearest route through the marsh, curved in a very specific way. It curved away from the western exit and toward the center of the wetland, where the ground was at its worst. It looked natural, but the edges of the firm path had been subtly reinforced with compacted plant matter and stones pressed just below the surface, making it more obviously walkable than the surrounding ground. Someone had built a road designed to look like it led somewhere useful. Dreth stepped off the path and turned his team around. He did not speak for a long time after that. Above, one of the observation dignitaries said something quietly to his companion. Counselor Veth continued recording. The technician running the remaining drones kept his eyes on his screen and his expression neutral. Bane watched the footage of Dreth's team extracting themselves from the marsh, and the footage of Orvin's team standing on an empty ridge breathing hard, and he said nothing at all. In a dry clearing on the northern edge of the forest, Rael and Sova met between two large trees. Sova reported what she had seen in the ravine. Rael listened without interrupting. The marsh group turned back, he said when she finished. I watched from the ridge. The lead hunter figured out the path. Faster than expected. Yes, Rael said. He was not bothered by this. He looked at Sova. That one is different. The others follow. That one thinks. Sova considered it. Is that a problem? Rael thought about the supply cache that would be dropped on the 6th cycle, standard Vorkai practice, resupply for the hunting team. He knew roughly where it would land based on where the team's shuttle had positioned itself on arrival. He had been thinking about the cache for 2 cycles. No, he said. It just means we will need to be more careful about what we say. Sova raised an eyebrow. When we talked to him, Rael said simply. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you think we will get that far? He looked at the forest, at the long light coming through the copper-colored leaves, and said nothing for a moment. Yes, he said finally. I think he is starting to wonder the same things we are. The supply cache came down on the 6th cycle, just as Rael had estimated. IT landed in a wide clearing on the western side of the forest, a standard Vorkai resupply pod, gray and rectangular, about the size of a large cargo box. It contained food, water, replacement equipment, and a fresh set of weapons for the hunting team. It had a locking code. It was meant only for the hunters. Rael and Sova reached it 4 hours before Dreth's team did. They did not open it. They did not try. They stood in front of it for a moment. Then Rael pressed his right palm flat against the outer casing, and Sova pressed hers beside it. The mud on their hands left 2 clear prints on the gray metal surface. They stepped back, looked at the prints, and walked away. That was all. When Dreth's team arrived at the cache, the lead hunter saw the handprints before Dreth did. He stopped walking and did not say a word. Dreth came forward and looked at them and felt something settle into his chest like a stone dropping into deep water. They had been there. They had stood close enough to touch the cache. They could have taken food, water, the weapons inside. They had taken nothing. They had left a message instead. Orvin's voice behind him was quiet. They could have armed themselves. Yes. Why didn't they? Dreth had no answer for that. He opened the cache and stood looking at the contents, all of it untouched, undisturbed, and he found that the food inside was not something he wanted just then. The hunt was now 6 cycles in. By every standard measure, it should have been over on the 3rd. The prey should have been exhausted, disoriented, making desperate choices. Instead, the 2 humans had eaten regularly, slept in rotation, built tools, read the terrain, mapped his team's movement patterns, disabled 3 drones with stone and wire, built false territory to drive his hunters away from sections of ground, and constructed a false road through a marsh that had nearly cost him a hunter in an afternoon. And now they had stood beside an unlocked weapons cache and chosen not to use it on the observation deck. The room was noticeably emptier than it had been. At the start, several dignitaries had quietly scheduled early departures. The ones who remained were not watching the way they had watched at the beginning, relaxed and expectant, waiting for the conclusion. They were watching carefully, leaning slightly forward, the way you watch something you were not sure you understood. Bane stood at his usual position. He had not moved much in the last cycle. He was looking at the screen that showed Dreth's team at the cache, and something in his face had gone hard and flat in a way that was not entirely about confidence. Counselor Veth was still recording. He had added 2 additional notation logs in the last cycle alone in the forest. Dreth made a decision that he told Orvin and the remaining hunters to hold position at the cache. He went alone, on foot, back into the trees, moving northeast. He moved carefully. He was not trying to hunt. He was not tracking. He was going to the last confirmed position from the drone records, and he was going to stand there and see what happened that he reached the location, a clearing between 3 large blackbark trees. And he stopped, and he spoke in trade script, loudly enough to carry. "I know you can hear me. I am alone." The forest did not answer. He stood there. 1 minute. 2. He kept his hands visible and his weapon on his back rather than in his grip. On the 3rd minute, Rail stepped out from between 2 trees on the north side of the clearing. He was standing about 15 meters away. His jumpsuit was dirty and repaired in 3 places with strips of bark fiber. He was barefoot. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been working rather than when they have been suffering. His face was calm, but he did not say anything. He waited. Dreth looked at him. This was a grade 3 prey item. Soft body. No clothes. No armor. No natural weapons of any kind. Not even shoes. "You did not take the weapons," Dreth said. Rail was quiet for a moment. Then, in slow and careful trade script, accented but clear, "We did not come here to fight you." Dreth felt the words land somewhere uncomfortable. "You are prey. This is a hunt. We know what this is," Rail said. "We have known since the first night." A pause. "We want to go home." Dreth did not have a prepared response for that. The hunt culture of the Vorkai had 17 traditional responses for prey, for begging, for bargaining, for aggression, for silence. There was no traditional response for this. For a prey animal that had outmaneuvered 6 trained hunters for 6 full cycles and then simply asked calmly to go home. Rail stood where he was and waited. Behind him, just inside the tree line, Sova was watching Dreth's hands and his posture and his breathing and cataloging all of it, because that was her habit, and she did not know yet whether this conversation would end quietly or not. It ended quietly. Dreth looked at Rail for a long time. The forest moved around them both. Then he looked away, toward the canopy, toward the pale green sky above it. "Stay here," he said. He turned and began walking back. Dreth walked back into the observation camp and called the hunt. That he used the formal Vorkai phrase. 3 words that officially ended the proceedings and removed all legal standing from further pursuit. He said them clearly, in front of Orvin and the remaining hunters and the camp's recording equipment. Then he transmitted the same phrase to the observation deck. The silence on the return channel lasted longer than it should have. Bane's voice came back hard and tight. "The hunt is not concluded. You have not achieved a result." "I have concluded it," Dreth said. "I'm the hunt leader. The decision is mine." Another silence. "You are ending this because of 2 prey animals," Bane said. The word prey came out sharp, with the emphasis of someone trying to put something back in its correct place. "I am ending it," Dreth said, "because there is nothing left to hunt." He cut the channel. When Rail and Sova walked into the observation camp between the trees, they were not restrained. Orvin watched them come and said nothing. The other hunters stepped back slightly, not out of fear exactly, but out of the particular discomfort of standing near something your instincts had categorized one way and your mind was being forced to recategorize another. Rail looked at the camp equipment, the supply cache, the thin structures the hunting team had built over 6 cycles. He did not look at it with satisfaction or triumph. He looked at it the way a tired person looks at a chair, with the simple interest of someone who wants to rest. Sova sat down on a supply crate and let out a slow breath. She looked at the sky for a moment and then closed her eyes briefly on the observation deck. Bane was attempting to issue a supplementary order, a second hunt designation, which was technically within his authority under the hunt charter. He was speaking with controlled force to the senior technician, who was listening carefully and typing nothing. The charter requires a hunt leader's objection to be on file before a secondary designation can be issued, the technician said. File it. It also requires the physical presence of the primary subject species to be unresolved. The technician looked at his screen. The subjects have voluntarily entered camp perimeter. That qualifies as resolved under Section 14. Bane stared at him at the far end of the room. Counselor Veth closed his recording instrument, placed it carefully in his coat, and stood. I will be filing a full observation report with the Interspecies Registry on our return. He spoke to no one in particular, which meant he was speaking to everyone. A complete record, from the point of subject release to the point of voluntary contact with hunt personnel. A brief pause. I expect it will require a new classification category. The existing ones do not seem to apply. He left the room without waiting for a response. Point 3 of the remaining dignitaries found reasons to leave shortly after. Bane stood alone at the observation screen and looked at the image of the camp below, at his 6 hunters, at the 2 small humans sitting among them, at Dreth standing at the edge of the camp looking out into the trees with his arms at his sides. The return vessel was prepared and cleared for descent by mid-cycle. Rail and Sova were brought aboard without ceremony. They were given water and plain rations, which they ate without complaint. Rail sat by a small porthole in the lower deck of the vessel as it lifted from the surface of Grath's Hollow. He watched the forest drop away below him. The black bark trees with their copper leaves, the dark lines of the creek channels, the pale flat clearing where the supply cache had been. He watched until the canopy became a texture, and then a color, and then disappeared into the green-gray of the atmosphere. Sova was already asleep in the seat beside him. Orvin passed through the lower deck on his way to the forward section and slowed as he went by. He stopped for a moment and looked at Rail the way a person looks at something they want to understand and have not yet managed to. He seemed to want to say something. Rail looked up at him and waited. Orvin did not find the words. He nodded once, which Rail returned, and moved on. The vessel cleared the atmosphere and the stars came out, sharp and dense, the way stars look from the dark between worlds. Rail watched them for a while through the porthole. He thought about the deep water back home, the pressure ridges and the cold columns, and the way the ocean kept its own time, indifferent to whoever was swimming through it. You learned it or you didn't. That was the whole lesson. Earth had been teaching it for a long time. The Vorkai had looked at humanity and seen soft bodies and slow reproduction and small size and called it grade 3. They had not looked at the ocean at the front of the vessel in the command section. Dreth sat alone in his chair and stared at the starfield ahead. Behind him, through the closed door, he could hear the faint sound of Bane's voice still attempting formal channels. Still try and make the outcome fit the category. Dreth did not listen. He thought about the clearing, about the moment Rail had stepped out from between the trees, about the absence of fear in that movement. Not the absence that came from being dangerous, but the absence that came from having already made a decision and being at peace with it. He thought about what it meant that a creature with no claws, no armor, and no natural weapons had spent 6 cycles choosing, at every available opportunity, not to harm anyone. He had no good word for it. Not in his language. Anyway, he thought maybe that was the beginning of the problem. And the beginning of something else that did not have a name yet, but would need one because the galaxy had just learned something about humans, and it could not unlearn it now.